Sounds great.
Okay. Welcome everyone to our first official web meeting for Woven. We had a nice introductory meeting just to see how many people were interested at the forum in Montreal this past May. So this is our first, if you will, formal meeting as a group. As you can see, we have this really awesome logo that Natasha Schatzman and Bill Warmbrodt allowed NASA folks to develop for us. So it's really, really great. And so today at our first meeting, what we want to do is just go over the survey that we sent out. We had a lot of response to it. It's really awesome. And then we'll go right into our speaker. And then from that, we'll finish up with questions and follow on for the next meeting. We haven't actually planned the next meeting yet, but we'll get that between now and probably late November, early December would be the next one. So let me jump right in and give you some of the stats from our survey. Okay, let me see. There we go. Okay, so our goal in Woven is, of course, to support women like ourselves. There's not that many of us, and we want to make sure that, we have kind of a good old women's system, just like there's a good old boys club. So to do that, we wanted to try to do discussion groups, seminars of topics of interest like today, and then peer mentoring. Those were the thoughts that we had before our meeting last May. And I think it's key that it's for women by women. And of course, we welcome anyone, especially the men who want to support us, because if we can't get men to support women, then we're never going to reach equality in the system. We had a survey in June. We had first the basic metrics so that we could set up a nice little email survey email list to make sure everybody keeps in. And of course, we were very curious to see who was interested. I'll show you the results of these in just a minute. And then we also came up with some topic areas of interest to drive our seminars and discussions, as well as what kind of activities you would like to see if you're part of Woven. And then finally, do you want to be part of the Woven leadership? Because I am trying to set this up with Natasha, but then we want a formal leadership without me, please, because I'm trying to slow down. But I think this is extremely important that we get something like this started. And I will tell you, there's been a lot of interest even outside of vertical lift engineering. And I've invited everyone. You don't have to be in vertical flight. I think the core mentoring and things like that that we do within VFS may be for those of us in vertical flight, but not to exclude anyone else, I think. So results. We have a very diverse group. I was really shocked. As of yesterday, we had 113 responses. And you see we have a good grouping of people all the way. We still have some people who are in school still, and so then they've only completed high school, but we have a lot of students in undergrad as well as those in the graduate program, and then people who are in industry. So a good broad offering of this. I was really pleased to see this. I think that's important. And you can see then the distribution across. And I hope to join that last group over on the right hand side as soon as I can. So in terms of topics of interest, everything pretty much got a lot of play, as you might expect. Some, such as internships and things, were more from the student interest. But it looks like it cut some of the stuff off. So climbing VFS leadership. So what do you have to do to be in the technical committees, the tech council, associate editors, things like that? That got about a third of the respondents' interest. Climbing the workplace leadership was very popular. And that is 60% of you were interested in that. A couple of other highlights is differences in working across academia, government, and industry, and they are there. And I think a lot of that has to do with the level of bias that you still see. Um, Technical field expertise. So looks like people would be interested in technical seminars in various regions. Mentoring, help in public speaking, some of those soft skills we've got. And then the highest is women in management. So how do you actually break the glass ceiling and get into management? So that's a big thing that people want to learn about. And I agree. If I was younger in my career, that's one of the big things I would want to know is I want to have, I have chosen to stay technical rather than go into academic administration, but I know a lot of people are interested in that. So activities, what kind of things do you want to see? Again, over 90% like the idea of these quarterly meetings, and that's indeed why we're having one. Then the second most popular was to get some one-on-one mentorship. There were women who were willing to help other women with technical writing, or women that wanted some help with technical writing. That's always an issue. And then we had other, and the biggest, I didn't include them all, but the biggest one was to have some sort of social activities. We'll have to brainstorm on that a little bit. But certainly I think at the forum, we can have them, the potential to have them, for example, at other locations. I'll be at European Rotorcraft Forum next week. I'll talk to them and see if they're interested in hosting something for the women that attend. Same thing for our transformative vertical flight, which is probably the second biggest VFS activity or conference that we have outside of the forum. And that is not only in San Francisco area, the Bay Area now, but also in the Phoenix area, and they alternate. They have different names, but that's what it is. And so this is basically all I wanted to do. I wanted to give you some feedback on it, so it wasn't just a black hole. You can still go on, and if you haven't filled it out, or even if you want to fill it out again, please feel free to do so. I don't have the SurveyMonkey link, but if you send me an email, I'll be glad to send it to you. I think the more inputs we get, the better. I think as we get into it, I might set up a new one that's just open thoughts. We could also set up something in Hover. The thing with Hover is that you would have to be a member of VFS. I don't know if we want to restrict it that much yet. I'll discuss with Natasha and leave it to the new leadership team. Any questions on what I've presented? I see y'all are all as eager as I am to get to the discussion today. So let me sign off, and Natasha, I'm going to turn this over to you now, and I'm going to mute myself.
All right, sounds good. So it is an honor to welcome our speaker today. She's originally from Spain. This is Dr. Maria Ribera Vicent. She completed her education in the U.S. and after obtaining a bachelor's in aerospace engineering from Parks College of St. Louis University in Missouri. She continued with an MS and a PhD, also in aerospace engineering at the Alfred Gusso Rotorcraft Center of University, or Center of Excellence, University of Maryland. And she was specializing in helicopter flight dynamics and simulation, and obtained the Amelia Earhart Fellowship and a Vertical Flight Foundation Award in the process. After graduation, she returned to Europe, settling in the UK. She was a Rolls-Royce Research Fellow at the University of Southampton for the next 5 years, working on multi-objective optimization tools for turbomachinery applications. When her second child was born, she took a break for 3 years, after which she returned to research with a Daphne Jackson Fellowship at the Surrey Space Center of the University of Surrey. She is now a senior teaching fellow at the Department of Aeronautics of Imperial College London, and as part of her pedagogic journey, she completed a Master of Education in Higher Education Learning and Teaching. I will say that during the talk, please make sure that you type your questions in the chat, and at the end, I will read them off. And with that, let's take it away, Dr. Ribera Vicent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha. Let me just share my screen now, if I can find it again. Here it is. Awesome. Well, thank you. And a lot of people, I think, expressed an interest in hearing more about the research I did during this Master's in Education in an imposter syndrome. So that's why I'm here today. And the topic of today is not about, whether women have it more or less. It's trying to understand why we get it. Why is it that we develop these feelings and very unpleasant, very uncomfortable feelings, and what can we do about it? And I think, I know that you all love to hide behind your cameras turned off, but one of the things that will work for everybody who has these feelings is, and this, as I will discuss, it's something that is suggested a lot in the literature, is to set up this as a support group. And if you can see each other a bit, and if I can see some of you as well, you don't know how to turn off your cameras, but if some of you do, you can see that there's a lot of people that are going to be engaging in this and feeling like recognizing some of the things I will say. And I think it will help people a bit as therapy as well, to see that other people are actually feeling the same way. Hello, Elise. Nice to see you. And if you want to, okay, no pressure. So this is about me. I am a fraud. I'm an imposter. I'm the fake. I am sure I got where I am to Imperial College. This is one of the best universities in the world, just by pure chance. I was lucky. I think probably they made some mistake when they hired me. I'm strongly suspect that I'm a diversity hire, that the fact that I'm a woman has something to do with it. I look around my colleagues and I know they're much more clever than I am. I don't feel as good as they are, and I'm feeling all the time that they're gonna find me out and kick me out of my job. Are any of these feelings familiar to you? Can I have a raise of hands? Anybody who has felt like this? We have 67 people in here. I'm sure there's gonna be quite a few that at some point have felt like this, right? Yeah, I'm seeing lots of hands right now. Yeah, so yeah, it's fine, you can lower them. So it's a very, very common feeling. Of course, this is not something I'm feeling all the time. It's not something I can claim that, it's just at this point dominating my life. But throughout my life, at some point or another, I felt like this. So you've heard my biography and I'm listening to it and like, oh, that's me actually, right? But it's hard to believe sometimes. And we tend to forget our accomplishments and feel a lot like this, like you see in the screen. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about imposter phenomenon. And I mentioned it, I'm calling it phenomenon here and not syndrome in this first slide, because psychologists and people, the experts in this area, they don't like to call it syndrome because it's not really an illness. It's not something that it's a recognized illness by the College of Psychology or anything like that. It's not, but they prefer the imposter phenomenon term. But I'm going to use both. Imposter syndrome is much more well known, so I'm going to use any of these terms anyway. So what is it? It's a feeling of fraudulence or inadequacy that people experience. And even when they see evidence of their achievements, of their talent, they still feel like a fraud. So this is what the phenomenon observes, is that sometimes people feel like this, even though they're not, even though they have evidence, but they can't help themselves and they feel like that. And these feelings happen to a lot of people, but they are very, very common among women, especially when they are in disciplines that are male-dominated. And the higher they go up and they get into more expert levels, they feel this more strongly. Men experience imposter syndrome too. I know I've seen there's a few men as well in the call today, and I welcome. And I hope that what I'm going to talk about today also resonates with some of you. There will be things that you will probably not feel like, but there will be things that will probably resonate with you as well. And if you don't feel imposter syndrome and you just here to support us, thank you very much. I hope there will be things also that will be useful to you on how you treat the people that work with you and how you can improve their lives and help them not to develop these feelings. I don't know if you're familiar with Among Us. It's a game kids play. My kids love this game, and it's a game in which you join and you're either a crew or an imposter, and all the players are crew except for one that is an imposter, and the imposter goes around killing other people, and the crew has to figure out who's the imposter. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the 500 and deeper PhD comics, and I really like this one because in academia, a lot of us are feeling like imposters, and that's a lot. The experiences of academia tend to push us towards these feelings a lot. So, imposter feelings, all these can have a really negative impact in the people who experience them, and they affect different areas of our lives. One of them is identity. People with imposter feelings experience a lack of confidence in their own abilities. They don't feel like an expert in their field, even though they quite likely are, especially if you get to this point of being a PhD in a very specialized area. And they tend to make very negative comparisons to others. They feel that everybody around them is much better than they are. And this affects their mental health. People with imposter feelings usually have a lot of stress and anxiety, which can lead to depression. And also, it happens that a lot of us tend to work ourselves to exhaustion and burnout because we feel that we're never enough, and we tend to want to do more to fit in, to impress others, to at least feel like we deserve a minimum of our of our position. Another impact that it has, and I feel this feels very close to my heart, this one is career sabotage. It feels like when you have imposter feelings, you tend to stop yourself from doing things and putting yourself out there. So either you're not feeling confident enough to publish your results, you don't feel like these are good enough, or that they're going to be well received, or you cannot face, like the criticism. You feel that lack of confidence when you apply for grants or for a job or fellowship opportunities. And some women drop out. Some people, not just women, maybe other people with imposter syndrome as well. But it's quite common for people to feel like they go to that point, they don't feel like they can endure it, and that they just drop out and sabotage their career entirely. So you can see that these very nasty, very negative feelings can have a pretty bad effect on people's lives. So it's obviously important that we can understand them, why they happen. For part of my research, I looked at the literature, and there's tons of literature, pedagogic literature that looks at this. And I'm not going to go over all of it, but I'm going to highlight 3 topics that I thought were very interesting, and that I thought that they link very well with my experience and the experience of the people that I interviewed for my research. So the first one is looking at the gender matters and the minority effect in general. Another one is attribution theory, which I found super interesting. And the third is self-efficacy. So let me start with the first one. So I found a really large review paper that had like, I don't know, 60 something papers with more than 14,000 participants that looked at imposter syndrome in different populations. And this paper found that about half of the papers that they were reviewing had looked at gender, and half of those showed that there was statistically significant evidence of higher imposter prevalence in women than in men. Even in the ones that they did not find statistically significant evidence, I looked a bit closer and found that they did not always split by all the possible comorbidities and the influence of other factors, such as the discipline, which I think is really important. And especially because in other papers I found, I saw that whenever there's professions where they're one sex predominant over the other, the individuals of the opposite sex are more likely to demonstrate imposter feelings. So this is really important here to understand that if you don't look at the statistics, combining both, you might not have always that same prevalence. But there were more papers that looked into this and showed that belonging to a marginalized group, somebody that feels excluded at the start in that discipline, can lead to people feeling like an imposter. So with this, I looked at more papers that sort of follow the paths and careers of female PhD students and see, because this is the where I'm going to be basing my research on, right? So I found that some studies that looked at the prevalence of imposter syndrome of women in academia, and it looked at all levels from undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, postdoc, and early career researchers and professors, and they found prevalence at all levels, higher in maybe at the graduate, early career researcher stage, but throughout they found prevalence, and they tend to go down with experience, but there's some doubts and feelings there in the later stages of their women's careers. And even though people in college did not really recognize these feelings, and they could not put usually a name or a label this experience they had, the experiences they had in college are also the seeds of imposter syndrome, that they, like, you know, how interacting with peers and things like that. There were experiences that led later to imposter syndromes, and I saw some of that evidence of that in my interviews, as well as I later. Other papers explored what are the kind of experiences in graduate school that tend to intensify these imposter feelings, and these of course affect women and men. But women felt them very strongly. Things like being admitted into a PhD program, which is already quite an achievement, and it makes you feel like, perhaps did I deserve this? This is how competitive is this? Did I earn this? Was it easy? Was it hard? Getting scholarships, publishing, this kind of experience tend to intensify imposter syndromes when there's a seed already there. Another part of the graduate school, especially, is exposure to public scrutiny. So the moment you start sitting in front of a committee, doing your PhD qualifying exam, your defense, conferences, all these experiences tend to put you in a spot that exacerbates and triggers these imposter feelings. They don't happen without a prior seed there and other factors, but these are things that tend to push you over and develop these feelings a lot more. But there was this hope, because some of the research I found says that imposterism, these imposter feelings, decrease when there's increased representation. So the more women you see doing well and succeeding, the less likely you are of developing these feelings. So let me tell you about this other theory that I found super interesting. It's called attribution theory. And it's not just a theory, it's a family of theories that were developed from the 50s, and they took another bout of popularity in the 80s. And since then, they have been used to try to explain imposter syndrome as well. And an attribution is a cognitive process that tries to explain the cause behind how you, what you ascribe as to a success or failure experience. And these theories look into different ways to attribute, to justify or explain success and failure. So these are the causal ascriptions. And they can be grouped in these major 5 areas. So one is ability, like aptitude, your intelligence, your talent. Another one is effort, how hard you work on something. Another one is luck, right? Which is something that we all refer to sometimes. Another one is task difficulty, right? Was the exam very hard, or was achieving a fellowship very hard, or something like that. And the last one is the circumstantial or temporal causes. So things like, the weather that day, was the teacher in a good mood when they set the exam? Do you have your period that day and you were feeling worse off and you did not do so well in this exam? So these are more circumstantial and temporal causes. And alongside this, there's what they call the causal dimensions. So one is the locus, and whether these attributions are internal or external to the individual. The other one is the stability. Is this something that you just have all the time, or does it change? And the last one is the controllability. How much can you do about that? So let's look at some of these together. So ability and aptitude is something that you tend to consider like internal cause, right? You either are or not. intelligent. Luck is something that is external. We cannot do anything about it, right? And it's not it's stable at all. It's quite unstable because it happens or not, and you have no control over it. So you can see you can put this together to try to make these attributions and or recognize how these attributions are made. So why is this relevant to us today? Because a lot of the research that has been done with imposter syndrome has looked into these ways in which people do these attributions. And I know, I mean, not all men, not all women, it's very hard to generalize, but statistically, a lot of women and most women would make attributions differently than men. So in general, men will attribute their success to internal causes, while women tend to internalize failure and externalize success. What does it mean? So if you're a man and something goes well, normally, and again, not everyone, not every circumstance, but this is quite general, they tend to attribute that to their own talent, their own abilities. But if something goes bad, they tend to externalize that. So it's either circumstances, they were not lucky, the exam was too difficult, something happened that is external to them and justifies the failure. But women tend to do exactly the opposite. I don't know if you feel this, recognize this in you, and you feel any thing being triggered by hearing this. But women tend to attribute their success to chance, being lucky, or there were no better candidates, there was a mistake. I'm here because that day nobody applied because they didn't notice their job advert. We try to justify our success in a million ways that is external to us. But if something goes bad, we own it. We own it badly. It's us. We did not work hard enough. We did not do enough. We're not talented enough. We're not as good as others. So we do own our failures internally very much. So these attributions are very, very strongly associated with imposter syndrome. So people who internalize success tend to have very low imposter syndrome scores, whereas people, mostly women, who tend to internalize failure, they usually have very high imposter syndrome scores. The third topic from the literature that I wanted to highlight is self-efficacy. And this is a concept developed from Bandura's social cognitive theory. And it means the self-belief that you can achieve something and complete a task. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's something that in the pedagogic circles they mention a lot. And the best example you can think of is if you have good self-efficacy, if you go towards an exam, you're confident you can do well, you work hard, so you have no reason to suspect that you would not do well in that exam. But if you have low self-efficacy, even if you're working hard, you still face that exam feeling like you're not going to do well, that it's going to be hard, that you're not going to be able to cope with it. And this is strongly linked as well with imposter syndrome. So people with high self-efficacy tend to attribute their failures to external causes, such as lack of effort, and the other way as well. Now, there are ways that Bandura suggests that we can develop good self-efficacy. One is through mastery experiences. So if you succeed many times by working hard, you have reasons to suspect that carrying on, you should expect another success. So that's one way. Another one is through vicarious experiences. I really like this one because, as you will see later, there's there's hope for people with imposter syndrome through living these vicarious experiences. So you see other people actually work hard and succeed repeatedly, people that you identify with, there's hope for you. You feel like there's a reason why you could also experience this kind of success. And the third one is a social persuasion. And this one is linked to feedback. So it means that what people say or what people tell us tends to influence also how we cope with things. So if people give us, valid reasons why we should be doing well, we end up believing it. If people give us good feedback about our work, we can believe that we can do well in that exam or in that test or whatever it is. Now, again, we can link this to gender, and this made me so angry when I saw it. You have no idea, and I suspect you probably will too when you hear it. So in a course, I think this is a study in some US university. I think it's a high school course in introductory physics. And it found that the girls that had an A in the class had similar self-efficacy to the boys that had a C. What does this mean? It means that these girls did not think themselves competent enough before doing their exam. And even though they did very well, they did not think they were good at physics. And they opted out of potential careers in engineering because their self-efficacy in physics was so low that they just didn't apply. They just didn't put themselves forward to carrying on doing physics. And it just my blood boiled when I read this paper. And it's just so sad. It's just sad because you see these young men who have, you know, worse grades, but they feel more confident about it and they put themselves forward to, you know, doing these careers. But strong, competent women in physics, they just didn't think they were good enough. And this probably has an impact in why so few go into careers in engineering. Now, the imposter syndrome is, in general, was linked to lower research self-efficacy. And I gave several examples of self-efficacy in academic circles in studying for an exam, but this also applies to research. So research self-efficacy will be things like your ability to carry out research, to get a grant, to produce impactful results, to defend them and disseminate them in conferences or journals. So a study by Justin and others found that when women were in PhD programs and they were interviewed, or I think surveyed, sorry, they found that they had very low self efficacy in research, and this was also correlated very well with their feelings of imposters. So having these feelings also affected motivation and persistence. By persistence meaning that these women maybe quit, or they did not carry out with an academic career, or they switched to something else. And the case of those, you know, high school students, they did not choose to carry on studying physics and opted out. And this final quote here at the bottom says that individual with low self-efficacy might feel incompetent, but an individual experiencing imposter phenomenon may feel incompetent despite the evidence of competence. So that's a bit of a difference between the two, but they are definitely related. So you see, I've gone over the literature that I explored, but let me tell you a bit more about what put me in this situation, or what the project was about. So as I mentioned, this is part of a master's in education thesis. As a person who works more in a teaching focused role, I was encouraged to do a bit more of those, you know, training and things. I ended up doing, you know, I started with a certificate and went all the way to a master's in education, and part of it was a thesis. I had to choose a topic myself, and I found one that I was very, you know, it was very close to my heart, is this issue of imposter syndrome. And because I saw so much of it, I've been for the first 5 years in this role, so not for the last year anymore, but I was the chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion committee in my department. And I talked to students and PhD students, and it just made me so sad to see that so many of them, you know, strong young women that are doing these careers, even years later, they're also developing these imposter feelings. And I wanted to know more about it. Why is it? What's happening? So that's why I started this project. I wanted to understand why. I was not going to look into whether men have it or not and what women better or worse. It's just, why does it happen? And I cannot understand all the entire population, but I could look at a niche group where I know the circumstances would be common enough, and try to see what it was that that was making them develop these feelings and act this way. So I interviewed 9 PhD students, female PhD students from Imperial College and from the Faculty of Engineering. So I invited people from several departments, and for anonymity, I did not release which departments was that. I'm not gonna, you know, deny whether there were any in my department or not, but from Imperial College. And I was advised to interview 6 to 8. I ended up with 9, but I think it was good. I didn't want to say no, because I think the experience of talking about it and seeing, you know, going through these questions and talking about it, I think it was therapeutical to them and also to myself as an interviewee. And it was really hard to stay objective and not to stray from the questions and not to ask leading questions. But I hope I did well. But I think at the end of the interview, of the records, it was nice to have a chat following that, and I think they found it useful to talk about it. So I didn't want to say no. So I ended up with lots of data. It was I had like 9 hours of interviews to sort through. So the pedagogic research falls into the qualitative side, and it's very different from what I was used to. And analyzing qualitative data is very, very different. And I found it, very surprising that 9 interviews was enough, even 6 interviews is enough. And I found that very strange at first, but I think I drew a lot of interesting conclusions, even from such a small sample of the population, and I hope it was useful. So once I had all these interviews, I coded them. And from those codes, I extracted 6 main themes that I think I'm going to discuss today. So let me give you a bit of an overview of my participants. They all were given pseudonyms. They were not, hopefully, nobody would be clear and identifiable. And in the UK, I think most of my audience today is from the US, and they are used to the US system. But in the UK, the PhDs are 3+ years. They're not 5 or 6 or 7 like mine. And so I asked for participants who would be in their 2nd or 3rd year, so they will have had a bit of time in the PhD program. And I had participants from a lot of different countries, none from the US, because we don't have a lot of students from the US here in the UK. But as you can see, we have quite a range of countries represented, which was useful because I could see some of the cultures and the effects of culture also coming through in their answers and how the imposter feelings were developing in them. So as I said, I interviewed them. I had lots of data was coded. This is just a map of the codes that came out of these conversations that we had. And then I went through all of that and tried to extract these themes. So these are the main themes I'm going to be talking about today. These are the family pressure and influence, the effect of society, the social conditioning, and this is the bigger one, comparing themselves to others, the elite nature of the university, and the lack of esteem and respect from others. So let me break them down one by one. Sorry. So the first one is family pressure. And in all of them, I have a little quote from what people would tell me in the interview. So in here, Heather says, I know my parents really wanted me to do well, so I did, I just wanted to please them. So even in the earlier stages, of imposter syndrome, right? Clans and IMs were the people who identified these imposter feelings and for the first time. So there were these two psychologists that found the coined the term. And among the reasons that they gave, they identified the effect of family dynamics in developing imposter syndromes. And they kind of looked at 2 possibilities in their patients, at least. They found these 2. One is that people that had a sibling, or some of the participants or patients that had a sibling that the family thought was the intelligent one, they found that these people were always compared negatively to that one, and they were always fighting to, impress their parents and feeling always inferior. On the other hand, there were people who found that the parents really thought the world of them. They thought really highly of them. They thought them superior in every way. So they had to fight to keep up and not disappoint them. So the expectations their parents have were hard to meet at some point in their career. So that is when they started to struggle. But in general, I found this in my participants as well in the interviews. All of them, without exception, they always felt a desire to please their parents. And I don't know if this is common to everybody, but they were trying, good students, people who work hard, who wanted to make their parents happy. It's funny because some of these expectations from parents, they sometimes were obviously very clear. They would tell me how their parents would tell them so. But in other cases, it was a perceived expectation. They perceived that their parents wanted them to do well, but they were never told so, directly, explicitly. But a lot of the time, this had an influence. And the interesting thing is that the family dynamics of my participants were very, very different. Some of them had were an only child. A Chinese student would be an only child. Some had lots of siblings, some were two girls, and the other ones was a girl in between two boys. And in all of them, some of what these categories that clans and names identify were kind of obvious, but not always. And so the dynamics in family can be very, very different. They don't necessarily follow those patterns. But in general, there was a feeling that people wanted to impress parents, not to disappoint parents, or had to compete for parents' attention. So that was very, very common. In most of the cases, not all, but most of the cases of the participants I had, a parental figure, whether a father, a mother, or an aunt, was in STEM, and very often they were had a PhD or worked in academia. So I think that puts them also to feel like they had to also do well in academia. So the next theme that I found that I saw very common in all of them is the expectations that women have in different societies and the role that they're expected to have. And in general, I saw that culture and society can, expectations they can affect imposter syndrome. In one hand, in some cultures, for instance, like in China, they found that education is wasted on a girl. And this, of course, was driving your feelings about yourself and your life and your self-belief from early on. Also, what are the roles that are okay in your culture for a woman to have? In some cultures, science is not at all something that girls are expected to do, is frowned upon. And it's interesting, for instance, in Thailand, science was acceptable, but engineering was not. So it makes women feel like a minority there, and that they're not doing, that there's something against what the culture finds acceptable. Some of my participants came from very sexist and patriarchal cultures and societies. And in particular, I found it very interesting that the Spanish and Italian participants had some very common experiences of being told what, not just the roles they had chosen, the careers they had chosen, they're not appropriate for women, but also the teachers. And I have a quote up there from Julieta saying that the teachers made not very nice comments about girls studying engineering. It really impacted me because she said how they had to do an oral exam in public in front of everybody. And if they did not answer something correctly, the teachers made really sexist comments. How, of course, this, what would you expect of a girl, right? Kind of thing. And they laughed it off because at the time they found it normal. That's how ingrained these comments are, that you just laugh it off and go along with it. And at the time they didn't think anything of it. They were so used to it. And now, with perspective after having lived away from that country and that society for a while, they're shocked a bit that not just that it happened, but that they took it like they did at the time. And in general, I talked to them about how the ratio of female students was in the STEM disciplines in physics and math as they progressed through education. And the ratios changed in different countries, but in all of them, there were more boys and girls in STEM classes and in physics or math. And it went lower and lower, fewer females as they progressed through from primary school to secondary school and to university. So that was very common to all of them, and that lower representation also affect how they felt about themselves and how their sense of belonging into their discipline, and a lot of the experiences they have were also related to that lower representation. Now, the next one, as I said, this is my biggest. This is the one I found that had the biggest impact. And so I'm going to spend several pages talking about this one. So it's the social conditioning. And what do I mean by social conditioning? So it's the way women are subliminally turned to think in a certain way. And how we end up accepting things or think in a certain way. I mentioned how these guys from Spain and Italy, they were completely used to the fact that men were making jokes about, them in front of everybody, right? So you just accept that, but there's so much more. So the first thing we're going to talk about this is values and behavior. The first is how we see the gender stereotypes. So from a very early age, we have seen this over and over. The way we're given toys, the games we're allowed to play, the roles we're allowed to take as children even, and the professions we're allowed to take as adults, they're all based on gender stereotypes, and a lot of these have been imposed on us, and they make no sense. Why wouldn't a woman not be a good engineer? It's absurd. There's no reason why we cannot do this, but we've been led and brainwashed to grown in these beliefs, in this set of beliefs that certain roles are more, for men, and there's no valid reason for it. But we feel in a way that we don't belong into that role. We don't belong in that discipline, because that's how we've been brainwashed so much. The other thing that is really affected by this social conditioning in terms of values and behaviors, in my opinion, is how there's all this bias in the values that are associated with gender. And the biggest example that I'm sure you've all heard is how if a man is assertive, it's a good positive quality, whereas if a woman is assertive, she's bossy, she's confident, there's all these negative connotations in things that should be positive qualities as well in women. But while things that are usually applauded in men, often they are rejected in women. And this is all this social conditioning that we, not just women, men and women, have grown with, and they tend to develop that way of thinking. And looking through my interviewees and their experiences, I saw lots of samples of these. And the biggest of these, the biggest example was, I call it modesty, is so many of them acted in ways because they did not want to stand out. They thought that if they stood out, they were going to be judged negatively. They were going to be considered a know-it-all. If you wanted to speak up and say what you thought about something, or you knew the right answer, if you're doing group work and you knew how to do something, but you did not want to be labeled a know-it-all in such a negative connotation. So a lot of them just kept it. They wouldn't speak up, and they wouldn't participate as much in a free way. They were not fully themselves because they wanted to be accepted. They wanted to fit in. Of course, we all want to fit in, and my participants would feel that acting a certain way will not allow them to fit in. Another example of all this social conditioning is how some of the participants mentioned that in internships or in their when they were doing practical work, or maybe they went to work after they finished their undergraduate before they went back to their PhD, they often were assigned to non-technical roles, even though they're perfectly qualified to do technical roles. Their male peers were given the technical roles because, in one example, it was really frustrating because the participants said that these other boys were really awkward socially, and of course they were just put in an office to do technical work, and because she was more easygoing and chatty, she was assigned the non-technical role. And why? I mean, she's just perfectly qualified to do the technical side, but all these things tend to condition people and to accept these behaviors, and it's just wrong. Another thing that I found that affected the way we've been conditioned to think and act and believe is how we react to harsh language. And some of them, like, they did not cope well with being told things in a very angry tone, and I think understanding this is important, because I mentioned how people earlier on, any man here who's not feeling like they feel important, and they can still be an ally. So understanding this, how women react to harsh language, because the way we've been conditioned to act and believe made them very, very vulnerable. So loud negative comments or being told off in a very aggressive way was pushing them, was triggering them to react in a very negative and way and get very, very upset. So more on this social conditioning. I told you all earlier about all this theory of attribution of success and failure, and here's why I link it to these interviews. So throughout my interviews, I saw lots of examples of these. The participants quickly externalized their successes and struggled really badly to accept any internal reason for their successes. Sorry, they externalized the success and they internalized their failures. And And I have an example there in my quotes there. So May, coming from China, a culture that relies a lot on luck. It says, I'm not confident because every time I get something, I feel that I'm lucky. So in particular, this participant, she feels that she is extremely lucky. I mentioned how luck is one of those attributions that is usually unstable, so not constant. But for May, it was the opposite. She thought it was stable. She thought that she was a lucky person, and all these things were happening to her because she was lucky, not because she was talented at all. So yeah, she got into a really prestigious program. She got all these opportunities, but she's assigned all these attributions to luck rather than herself and her own talent. So as I said, all of these participants, they took ownership of their failures, they assumed responsibility, and they thought it was completely out of them not having the intelligence or the skills or the talent to succeed in those areas. And some examples of this, I mentioned how May attributed everything that went well in her life to luck. I had examples of people that said, yeah, I had positive feedback about something I did, but I'm sure it was due to things other people had done before me that I took some of the credit for that, instead of taking ownership of that feedback that it was deserved. Or some of them, when they were offered their PhDs by their PIs, so some of them did the masters with these PIs, and after a while, so they left, and the PI offered them a PhD. And they thought that, oh my goodness, this PI has to be really desperate, not finding any other candidates, that they had to come and ask me, right? So they thought it was out of lack of other potential candidates to do the job. So there must be nobody else. That's what they look at me. Some of them thought that any success they had was due to an unfair advantage, whether it was the luck of the situation. May mention luck a lot. Some of them felt like, one of them, for instance, went on a year abroad, and when she thought it had been easier, so her marks were higher because that year abroad had been easier than it would have been at home. Or one changed schools to another district, and she thought those students were less prepared than herself, so she thought she had an unfair advantage. That's why she did well. So usually they looked at success outside of themselves instead of looking at their own talent. And at the same time, any failure, incompetence, they took full ownership of that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was self-efficacy. We talked about the theory earlier, right? And I saw plenty of evidence of that as well. We thought that social persuasion, what other people tell us, and was important to how people feel about themselves. So these participants, if something went well, they express surprise. If they got positive comments from a supervisor, if some success in a grant or something, they found that they did not expect that. They did not have the self-efficacy to expect that if they had worked hard towards it, they would get it and they would do well. It always came as a surprise because they usually found that they usually thought very, very little of their own work. I found lots of evidence of that, thinking that they were not good enough, that they were not good enough to present in a conference or to publish. This was a very, very common trait in my interviews. And also the reaction to feedback. So I found that feedback is really, really important here, that if they had positive feedback, if they found it, if it was constructive feedback, they took it very well, even if it was not always positive, as long as it was framed in a nice way. The language, I mentioned the language, the negative language earlier. But also positive feedback could be addictive because they found that they had to work really hard to continue getting that positive feedback, and it led to burnout. But one thing that I found very, very interesting, and maybe you have experienced this as well, is that for women in general, lack of feedback is seen as a negative aspect. It's a negative feedback. So you go to a meeting and you don't hear anything, you go home thinking, oh my goodness, that went so badly. Whereas a man, negative, there's no feedback, they just carry on great. This really went really well. So there are actions, there are things that we can do about it. I've noticed I'm 40 minutes in, so I'm going to try to be quick. So the other thing is comparing yourselves to others. So people tend to look around and they made lots of comparisons to what the people they have. So people, when they see other peers that know a lot more than themselves, that made them feel quite inferior. But sometimes other people were the ones who highlighting those things out of jealousy or other reasons. And I think people who are feeling not very confident themselves tend to humiliate others, and women take that very, very strongly and tend to feel very little about themselves. But I found that in looking around, they found that my participants found that their work was of less quality than others, and there was very little representation of females, so that also affected their sense of belonging in their field. And an interesting thing is that they did not feel like experts, even when I highlighted, but you are probably know more about this topic than 99.9% of the world's population. Is that not making you an expert? They still didn't think confident enough to think themselves of an expert. The next thing I looked into and is the elite nature of the university. So I found that being surrounded by very talented students also highlighted and tended to trigger these imposter feelings. And being in a research group that had, a very prestigious PI or a very prestigious university made them feel pressure to produce really high quality work, and this also triggered imposter feelings. At the same time, sometimes they blamed the institution, the very prestigious institution, as the reason why they got awards or things like that. So they felt they externalized some of this success if they got an award or something, and blamed it on the elite nature of the university. And this is last one is the worst, I think. Well, not the worst, probably the social conditioning, but it made me really sad, is when people lack of esteem is affected their sense of belonging. And the lack of esteem is what other people think of us and how they manifest it. So family, classmates, or peers in your groups of work, they might tell you things like that and or not consider you strong enough, your fellow peers. I have had the participant mention things like how other people in their, research groups or that they met at lunch, things like that. They would say things like, oh, but you will have it easier because you're a woman to get a job in academia because they need women and things like that. So these things tend to erode the confidence and make them feel like imposters, that they really don't deserve their accolades or the work that they get. The worst one is when they go to conferences and they are confused with people who, are not in the conference as professionals, but maybe they were offered, sometimes they would consider the partners or wives or girlfriends of other people instead of being there on their own merit as attendees. And this happened a lot. Comments, sexist comments, they've experienced sexist comments in conferences. And this lack of esteem in a professional setting really, really affected them and made them feel inferior and very, very little and very, very upset. I'm going very quick, sorry, because I know I'm over time. I'm going to skip this slide. So, but what can we do about this? And this is like the whole point, right? We've identified all these possible reasons. Is there things we can do? Well, there's some things we cannot really do much about. We cannot change society. We cannot change our families and our histories. But we can slowly try to make society more equitative and better and through work and through our actions in society. We can try, but it's not easy, but we can go that way. But for understanding that this social conditioning exists, that all these situation exists for women much more likely than for men, and makes us more vulnerable when we are in spaces that are normally male dominated, it should encourage us all to be considerate, not to give any kind of preferential treatment or positive discrimination. I'm not saying that, but just be considerate that there's all this past behind us, that there's all these things that are making us susceptible and vulnerable, and just be patient and try to be more understanding, and that might actually take us a long way. But there are things we can do. So research supervisors, managers, mentors, depending on the context, there are things you can do. So I mentioned these vicarious experiences of success and failure, right? If you talk about your failures to your students or to your mentees, there was an article, I think it was in Nature, like a CV of failures, listing all the things that have gone wrong all your life, all your rejections and things. It can actually be quite positive for people that come behind it. Actually, this one tiny failure actually means nothing. Look at that person so successful and doing, and actually has all these other failures behind. The other thing we can do is provide better feedback. Whether it's the feedback sandwich, a positive thing, between, the two positives between the negative, but also verbalizing feedback when it's positive. So if you think something's good, just say it. Don't just let them go thinking that your silence means positive. Just say something, even if it's something small. You don't have to make up stuff. You don't have to exaggerate, but just verbalize it, because women need to hear that positive feedback. Otherwise, they go away thinking that is wrong. Creating a community of practice within your research group is also very useful, because it can mix people at different stages of the journey, and also they can learn from each other and see what's normal. And for mentors, also like helping their mentees focus on their accomplishments, and helping them make correct attribution processes, and having a growth mindset can be also very good. Academic institutions and employers can also do stuff about this. They can provide early interventions, because I think you probably, the moment you can think back at the moment when you thought first, what is this imposter syndrome, when you hear it? And having that awareness of it can be very, very useful. You can create structures that can foster the integration. I mentioned the community of practice. You can foster them at the university level or at the company level, that create a community of practice where people can share their stages and their experiences. And you can provide training for supervisors, and giving feedback, for instance, can be very, very good on how different groups receive feedback and react to feedback. And also you can provide graduate students, for instance, with the necessary training skills that they need to be successful in academia, like academic writing and publishing protocols. Women, what can you do about it? What can we do about it? I'm completely against the concept of women having to solve all our problems. I'm not saying women should fix women. I think society, everybody needs to work towards this, towards equality and equity. As Marilyn was saying earlier, it's not just about us doing all the work. But since we have this problem, there are things we can do to try to get better. I think the first one is understanding it, understanding what it is. And once you know, it's the first step. Okay, I can see that this thing is unreasonable. It's a syndrome. A lot of people have it, and if I understand it, maybe I can get better. I can try to recognize it and avoid it. Group therapy. That's one thing that Clance and Imes, the ones that coined the term initially, that they proposed these interventions. And when people were discussing things together, they found that they recognized that other talented women that they admired, they could not be imposters, right? And these women were feeling like imposters. So having these conversations, I wish we could have done this in person, and we could see each other and discuss this. And you were like, it's not possible. And I remember Marilyn saying on the first meeting, like, I feel like an imposter sometimes. Like, I said, no way, you cannot feel like about it. You're so successful. You're an equals collector. And just having these conversations as a group therapy, I think, can be very, very useful to recognize it and to realize that these imposter feelings are most of the time, or probably every time, out of place and not deserved. You can keep a diary of your successes every time. Just write it down, and every now and when you're feeling low, go and open the diary and look at it. And also, if you receive feedback, write it up and keep a record of it, and also how you react to it, and accepting feedback. And sometimes we don't react well to taking feedback, and it's important also to be able to take feedback properly. Closing thoughts, a lot of what I've said, it's very specific to this very niche group of population, right? Women in engineering and male-dominated disciplines, but a lot of the stuff is probably common to other disciplines and also common to men. So hopefully you've found something useful. I heard a person who worked in equality here in the university at Imperial College once said that what's good for women is good for everyone. And if you take all this training that you could have that help women, overcome imposter syndrome, if men take it, it can help them too. All these measures are good for everyone, not just for women. So it can benefit society as a whole. And that's it very much. I have put some of my references here. You don't have to read them. There's a few more in my thesis. But that brings me to the end. I really, really thank you for the opportunity to tell you all the research I did. And I hope you found it useful, that if some of it resonated with you. And I haven't looked at the chat yet. Sorry, I've been focusing on going through this material. And I welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent. Okay, we've had wonderful discussion and beautiful conversation between some two leaders in the Vertical Flight Society, Susan Gordon and Professor Marilyn Smith, and that was just some great things that were going on. And so kudos to those folks that kind of shared their story. And so that was lovely seeing that. I don't see any questions. I know we're a little bit over time and folks are starting to leave, but thank you for presenting this. Really kind of put things in a more, made me feel like a more articulate way to kind of express what I have. So my psychiatrist actually told me, have you heard of imposter syndrome? I was like, oh, yes. And the group therapy, that was a big thing that also helped me. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because this really just kind of allows me to articulate a little bit better and understand my feelings. So when there's kind of an educational research and backing to why I feel the way I do. So I really, oh, that was just, it was really wonderful. So thank you for that. Let's see, am I seeing any questions? And if you want to come on to ask, please don't hesitate to speak up. Oh, here we have another, we have one by Annika Bobbin. Hopefully I said your name right. She goes, do you think imposter syndrome affects people differently, biased on cultural or gender backgrounds? If so, how can organizations address these differences?
Well, yes, I think it does, and